Chapter 1. As the full moon rose high in the sky, Emily could feel the familiar tug of the transformation beginning to take hold. She had been a werewolf for as long as she could remember, and every month, on the night of the full moon, she was forced to confront the beast within her. But tonight was different. Tonight, she was not alone. She and her boyfriend, Jake, had been dating for a few months now, and he knew about her secret. At first, he had been terrified when she had revealed the truth to him, but over time, he had come to accept it and even embrace it. Tonight, they had decided to run together, to embrace their primal sides and let the wolves within them roam free. As Emily's bones began to shift and her fur started to sprout, she looked over at Jake and saw that he was undergoing the same transformation. She let out a howl of excitement and took off into the forest, with Jake hot on her heels. The two of them ran through the trees, their senses heightened and their connection to each other stronger than ever. They chased each other through the underbrush, playfully nipping at each other's tails as they went. As the night wore on, they began to tire, and eventually, they found themselves at the edge of a clearing, panting heavily and covered in sweat. Without a word, Jake leaned in and pressed his lips to Emily's, kissing her deeply as their fur began to recede and their bodies returned to their human forms. As they lay there, wrapped up in each other's embrace, Emily knew that she had found her true mate. She had found someone who accepted and loved her for who she was, even with all of her quirks and imperfections. And as they watched the sunrise together, Emily knew that she had finally found her happily ever after. Chapter 2. The next morning, Emily and Jake woke up to the sound of birds singing and the warm sunshine streaming through the trees. They lay there for a moment, wrapped up in each other's embrace, before reluctantly getting up and starting their day. As they made their way back to civilization, Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of unease creeping over her. She knew that they couldn't keep running together like this forever. Eventually, they would have to face the reality of their situation and figure out what to do next. When they arrived back at Emily's apartment, they sat down at the kitchen table and tried to come up with a plan. "We can't keep hiding like this," Emily said, her voice laced with frustration. "We need to find a way to control the transformation, or at least find a way to hide it from the rest of the world." Jake nodded in agreement. "I know it's not going to be easy, but we'll figure it out. We'll find a way to make this work." Over the next few weeks, Emily and Jake threw themselves into finding a solution. They scoured books and internet forums, looking for any hint of a way to control the transformation or keep it hidden. Eventually, they stumbled upon a group of werewolves who had managed to find a way to suppress the transformation using a special herb. Excited by the possibility of a solution, Emily and Jake set off to find the herb and bring it back to try for themselves. After weeks of searching, they finally found the herb and brought it back to their home. They brewed it into a tea and drank it together, crossing their fingers and hoping for the best. To their amazement, it worked. The transformation was suppressed, and for the first time in their lives, Emily and Jake were able to live normal, human lives. As they sat on the couch, basking in the warmth of their newfound freedom, Emily leaned her head on Jake's shoulder and whispered, "I love you." Jake wrapped his arm around her and replied, "I love you too. And I'll always be here to support you, no matter what life throws our way." Together, Emily and Jake faced the challenges that came their way and found a way to live happily ever after, with the love and support of each other. The end. Chapter 3. As the years went by, Emily and Jake's love only grew stronger. They were able to live normal, human lives without the burden of the transformation hanging over them, and they were grateful for the herb that had given them this gift. But as they settled into their new normal, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. They both missed the thrill of the transformation and the freedom that came with it. One night, as they sat on the porch watching the full moon rise in the sky, Emily turned to Jake and said, "I know we made a choice to suppress the transformation, but I can't help feeling like we're missing out on something." Jake nodded in agreement. I feel the same way. But what are we supposed to do? We can't just go back to the way things were before. Emily sighed. I know. But maybe there's a way we can find a balance. Maybe we can find a way to transform just once a month, or even less. We could find a way to control it, like we did with the herb. Jake's eyes lit up. You know, I've been thinking about that too. I think it's worth a try. We can research it and see if it's possible. And so, Emily and Jake set off on a new journey, determined to find a way to balance their human lives with their werewolf sides. It wasn't easy, and there were many setbacks along the way, but they never gave up. Finally, after months of hard work and determination, they found a way to transform just once a month, on the night of the full moon. It wasn't perfect, but it was a compromise they were both happy with. As they stood on the porch, watching the full moon rise in the sky, Emily turned to Jake and said, I'm so glad we found a way to make this work. I love you, and I wouldn't want to go through this journey with anyone else. Jake wrapped his arms around her and replied, I love you too, Emily. And I'll always be here to support you, no matter what. Together, Emily and Jake found a way to balance their love for each other with their love for the freedom and excitement of the transformation. And as they stood there, watching the full moon rise in the sky, they knew that they had finally found their happily ever after. Chapter 4. As Emily and Jake settled into their new routine, they couldn't help but feel grateful for the herb that had allowed them to find a balance between their human and werewolf sides. They were able to live normal, human lives for the majority of the month, but on the night of the full moon, they were able to embrace their primal instincts and run free as wolves. But as the years went by, they started to notice that the herb seemed to be losing its effectiveness. The transformation was becoming harder to suppress, and they were starting to worry that they might have to give it up entirely. One night, as they sat on the porch staring up at the full moon, Jake turned to Emily and said, I don't know how much longer we can keep this up. The herb is losing its effectiveness and I'm starting to worry that we might have to give it up entirely. Emily sighed and nodded in agreement. I know. It's been a great solution, but I don't know if it's going to work for much longer. We might have to face the reality of the situation and find a new way to handle it. Jake nodded gravely. I know it won't be easy, but we'll figure it out. We always do. And so, Emily and Jake set off on a new journey, determined to find a way to balance their human lives with their werewolf sides. They scoured books and internet forums, looking for any hint of a solution. After months of hard work and determination, they finally stumbled upon a group of werewolves who had found a way to fully control the transformation. They had developed a set of techniques and exercises that allowed them to transform at will, and they were able to maintain their human lives while still embracing their primal instincts. Excited by the possibility of a permanent solution, Emily and Jake set off to meet with the group and learn their techniques. It was a long and difficult process, but eventually, they were able to master the techniques and fully control their transformation. As they stood on the porch, watching the full moon rise in the sky, Emily turned to Jake and said, I can't believe we finally did it. We found a way to fully control the transformation and still live normal, human lives. Jake wrapped his arms around her and replied, I know. It wasn't easy, but we did it. And I'm so glad we were able to do it together. Chapter 5. As Emily and Jake settled into their new routine, they couldn't help but feel grateful for the techniques that had allowed them to fully control their transformation. They were able to live normal, human lives for the majority of the month, but on the nights of the full moon, they were able to embrace their primal instincts and run free as wolves. But as the years went by, they started to realize that their lives as werewolves were not as simple as they had once thought. There were still dangers lurking around every corner, and they had to be constantly on guard to protect themselves and those around them. One night, as they were out running in the woods, they stumbled upon a group of hunters who had been tracking them for weeks. The hunters were determined to capture and study the werewolves, and they weren't going to let Emily and Jake get away. As the hunters closed in, Emily and Jake knew they had to fight for their lives. They transformed into their wolf forms and charged at the hunters, their teeth bared and their claws outstretched. The fight was fierce and intense, but in the end, Emily and Jake emerged victorious. They had managed to fight off the hunters and protect themselves and their way of life. As they stood panting and covered in sweat, Emily turned to Jake and said, "We can't keep living like this. We can't constantly be on guard and always looking over our shoulders. We need to find a way to live in peace." Jake nodded in agreement. "I know. We need to find a way to coexist with humans and not constantly be at odds with them." And so, Emily and Jake set off on a new journey, determined to find a way to live in harmony with humans. Chapter 6. Emily and Jake were two werewolves who had always tried to keep a low profile. They lived in a small town in the countryside and did their best to avoid attracting attention to themselves. However, one day they received word that a group of werewolf hunters had arrived in town and were planning to hunt them down. Determined to stop the hunters from hurting anyone, Emily and Jake decided to track them down and try to reason with them. They knew that the hunters would likely not listen to them, but they had to try. After a few hours of searching, they finally found the hunters camping out in a clearing in the woods. Emily and Jake approached cautiously, trying to appear non-threatening. "Please, listen to us," Emily said, holding up her hands in a peaceful gesture. "We are not a threat to humans. We just want to live our lives in peace." But the hunters were not interested in listening. They sneered at Emily and Jake, brandishing their weapons. "You monsters deserve to die," one of them spat out. Jake tried to reason with them, explaining that werewolves were just like any other beings and that they had families and friends who cared about them. But the hunters would not listen. As the situation became increasingly tense, Emily was hit by a tranquilizer dart. Jake managed to catch her before she fell to the ground, and he knew he had to get her out of there. He scooped her up in his arms and ran as fast as he could through the woods, trying to put as much distance between them and the hunters as possible. As he ran, he could feel Emily's body growing weaker and weaker. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Jake reached the safety of their home. He laid Emily down on the couch and tended to her wounds as best he could. As Emily lay there, unconscious and wounded, Jake vowed to do everything in his power to protect her and the other werewolves from the hunters. He knew it would not be easy, but he was determined to do whatever it took to keep them safe. Chapter 7. As Jake tended to Emily's wounds, he noticed that the tranquilizer dart that had hit her was coated in a strange, greenish substance. He had a feeling that this substance was not meant to knock Emily out, but rather to kill her. Determined to save Emily's life, Jake knew he had to act fast. He remembered the location of the hunter's campsite and decided to sneak back there to see if he could find any clues about the poison. Jake made his way back to the clearing where he had encountered the hunters earlier. He searched their campsite and found several vials of the same greenish poison that had been used on Emily. He also found a map with the location of their base marked on it. With a plan forming in his mind, Jake set off towards the base. He knew it was risky, but he had to try to save Emily's life. When he arrived at the base, Jake found the hunters sleeping. He crept past them, careful not to wake them up, until he found the leader's tent. He slipped inside and grabbed the leader, pulling him out of the tent. "What do you want from me?" the leader growled, struggling against Jake's grip. "I want to know what this poison is and how to cure it," Jake replied, holding up one of the vials. "My mate, Emily, has been hit with it and she's going to die if I don't find a cure." The leader's face softened a bit at the mention of a mate. "I'll tell you what I know, but you have to promise to let me go." Jake hesitated for a moment, but he knew he had to do whatever it took to save Emily. "I promise," he said. The leader told Jake that the poison was a rare and highly toxic substance that was only used by the most ruthless of werewolf hunters. He also told Jake that the only known cure was a rare herb that grew deep in the forest. With this information, Jake knew he had to find the herb and bring it back to Emily as quickly as possible. He thanked the leader and let him go, promising to keep his word and not hurt any more werewolves. Jake raced back to Emily, praying that he would be able to find the herb and save her life. He searched through the forest, frantically looking for the rare plant. Finally, after what felt like hours, he found it. He picked as much of the herb as he could carry and rushed back to Emily. She was still unconscious, but Jake could see that the poison was beginning to take its toll on her body. He ground up the herb and mixed it into a paste, which he applied to Emily's wounds. He held his breath, hoping that it would work. And it did. Over the next few hours, Emily's condition began to improve. The poison left her body, and she slowly regained consciousness. Jake held her hand, tears of relief streaming down his face. He had never been so grateful to have found a cure. And he knew that he had the hunters to thank for it. Chapter 8. The next day, Jake woke up to find that Emily's condition had worsened. Despite his best efforts, the herb he had used on her had not worked and the poison was still coursing through her veins. Jake was devastated. He had been so sure that the herb was the cure, but now it seemed that it had only made things worse. He had been duped by the hunter leader, who had lied about the herb's effects in order to save his own skin. Jake knew he had to act fast if he wanted to save Emily's life. He raced back to the hunter's base, determined to find the real cure. When he arrived, the hunters were waiting for him. They had expected Jake to come back, and they were ready for a fight. Jake didn't hesitate. He charged at the hunters, his werewolf strength and speed giving him an advantage. He fought with all his might, taking down one hunter after another. Finally, he reached the leader's tent. He burst inside and grabbed the leader, holding him by the throat. "Where is the real cure for the poison?" Jake growled. "Tell me now, or I'll make you pay." The leader's face paled. He knew that Jake was serious. "The cure is a rare flower that grows on the highest peak of the mountain," he gasped out. "But you'll never make it there in time." Jake didn't waste any time. He let go of the leader and raced back to Emily, hoping against hope that he would be able to find the flower in time to save her. He ran through the forest, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he had to be fast, but he also had to be careful. The mountain was treacherous, and one wrong step could mean disaster. As he neared the peak, Jake saw the flower. It was a delicate, purple blossom that seemed to glow in the darkness. He plucked it and raced back down the mountain, hoping that it would be the cure he had been searching for. When he returned to Emily, he crushed the flower and applied it to her wounds. He held his breath, praying that it would work. And it did. Within a few hours, Emily's condition began to improve. The poison left her body, and she slowly regained consciousness. Jake held her hand, tears of relief streaming down his face. He had never been so grateful to have found the real cure. And he knew that he had Emily to thank for giving him the strength and determination to keep going. Chapter 9. After Jake had cured Emily, he thought that their troubles were finally over. But he was wrong. One day, as they were sitting in their living room, they heard a knock at the door. Jake opened it to find a group of hunters standing on the porch, their weapons drawn. "We know you're in there, you monsters," the leader sneered. "And we're here to finish what we started." Jake tried to reason with the hunters, explaining that he and Emily were not a threat to humans. But the hunters would not listen. They were convinced that all werewolves were dangerous and needed to be eliminated. Jake and Emily knew they had no choice but to defend themselves. They transformed into their werewolf forms and charged at the hunters, ready to fight for their lives. The battle was fierce, with both sides taking heavy blows. But the hunters had the advantage of numbers, and Jake and Emily were eventually overpowered. They were captured and taken to the hunters' base, where they were thrown into a cell and left to rot. Jake and Emily were determined to escape, but they knew it would not be easy. They were heavily guarded, and they had no idea where they were or how to get back home. But they were not about to give up. They worked together, using all their strength and cunning to try to find a way out. And finally, after weeks of trying, they managed to escape. They ran through the forest, dodging bullets and outwitting the hunters at every turn. When they finally made it back home, they collapsed onto the couch, exhausted but triumphant. Jake wrapped his arm around Emily and pulled her close. "We did it," he whispered. "We're free." Emily smiled up at him, tears of joy streaming down her face. "We're free," she repeated. And in that moment, Jake knew that he would do anything to protect Emily and the other werewolves. They had faced danger and adversity, but they had come out on top. And he knew that as long as they were together, they could overcome anything. Chapter 10. Jake and Emily knew that they could not stay in the same town now that the hunters were aware of their existence. They gathered up their belongings and fled to a remote cabin in the woods, determined to start a new life far away from the danger and persecution they had faced before. For a while, it seemed as though their troubles were over. They lived a simple but happy life, enjoying the peace and solitude of their new home. But one day, everything changed. A strange man appeared at their door, a sly grin on his face. He introduced himself as a journalist, and he had a proposition for Jake and Emily. "I know what you are," the man said, his eyes glinting with greed. "And I know that the hunters would pay a pretty penny to find out where you are. But I'm willing to keep your secret, for a price." Jake and Emily were shocked. They had thought they were safe, but it seemed that they were still being hunted. "What do you want?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man named a sum that was exorbitant, far more money than Jake and Emily had. "That's our final offer," the man said. "Take it or leave it." Jake and Emily knew they had no choice. They had to find a way to come up with the money or risk being exposed. They worked hard, taking on extra jobs and scrimping and saving every penny. Finally, after months of hard work, they had saved up enough money to pay the man. They met him in a deserted parking lot, their hands shaking as they handed over the cash. The man counted the money, a satisfied smile on his face. "Consider our deal done," he said. "I won't say a word to anyone about you. But if I ever see you again, I won't be so forgiving." Jake and Emily watched as the man got into his car and drove away, their hearts heavy with the weight of what they had just done. They knew they had made a deal with the devil, and they could only hope that the man would keep his word. But they also knew that they could not live in fear forever. They had to find a way to protect themselves and their community, no matter what the cost. And they were determined to do whatever it took to keep themselves safe. Chapter 11. Jake and Emily thought they had finally found peace, but they were wrong. Despite their efforts to pay the man off, he did not keep his word. He told the hunters about Jake and Emily's whereabouts, and before they knew it, the hunters were on their doorstep once again. Jake and Emily knew they had to run, but they also knew they couldn't leave each other behind. They grabbed their bags and fled into the woods, their hearts pounding in their chests. But they were not fast enough. The hunters caught up with them, and in the chaos of the chase, Emily stumbled and fell. Jake tried to help her up, but it was too late. The hunters had surrounded them, their weapons drawn. Jake knew he had to act fast if he wanted to save Emily. He transformed into his werewolf form and charged at the hunters, taking them down one by one. But even with his strength and speed, he was no match for their numbers. As he fought, he could feel Emily slipping away from him. He knew he had to get her to safety, no matter what it took. With a final burst of energy, Jake scooped Emily up in his arms and ran as fast as he could through the woods. He could hear the hunters behind him, but he didn't look back. He just kept running, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Jake reached the safety of their cabin. He laid Emily down on the couch and tended to her wounds as best he could. As Emily lay there, unconscious and injured, Jake knew that he had to do something to protect her and the other werewolves. He couldn't just sit by and wait for the hunters to come after them again. Jake made a decision. He would gather together all the werewolves he could find and form a pack. Together, they would stand up to the hunters and fight for their right to live in peace. And with that, Jake began to put his plan into action. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to do whatever it took to keep Emily and the others safe. Chapter 12. Jake knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed help if he wanted to take down the hunters and protect his community. So, he made a difficult decision. He went back to his father, the alpha of their pack, and asked for his help. His father was hesitant at first, but he eventually agreed to gather together a pack of werewolves to help Jake in his fight against the hunters. Together, they trained and prepared for battle, determined to put an end to the hunters once and for all. The day of the attack arrived, and Jake and his pack were ready. They charged at the hunters with a ferocity that caught them off guard. The battle was fierce, with both sides taking heavy blows. But Jake and his pack had the advantage of numbers and training, and they eventually overpowered the hunters. When it was all over, the hunters lay dead on the ground. Jake and his pack had won the battle, and they had finally brought an end to the hunters' reign of terror. Jake stood over the bodies, his chest heaving with exertion. He had done it. He had protected Emily and the other werewolves, and he had brought peace to their community. As he turned to leave, he saw Emily standing at the edge of the clearing. She ran towards him, tears of joy streaming down her face. "We did it," she whispered, throwing her arms around him. "We're free." Jake held her close, knowing that they had overcome unimaginable odds to get to this point. And as he looked into Emily's eyes, he knew that no matter what challenges they faced in the future, they would always be there for each other. If you liked this video, please give it a like and share. Subscribe the channel for more amazing stories.